Guten Abend allerseits, herzlich willkommen. Ich entschuldige mich für die Verspätung. Wir hatten hier noch so ein paar organisatorische Fragen zu klären. Ich freue mich sehr, dass Sie alle da sind. Mein Name ist Imme Scholz, ich bin Vorständin der Stiftung hier. Heute Abend wollen wir über einen Vorschlag sprechen, der eine Alternative zum gegenwärtigen System der Entwicklungszusammenarbeit sein soll, das Global Public Investment Konzept. Denn diese Entwicklungszusammenarbeit, die manchmal immer noch als Entwicklungshilfe bezeichnet wird, steht unter Druck. Das wissen Sie alle genauso gut wie ich. Ich benenne die Punkte nochmal trotzdem. Ich denke, der Druck entsteht zum einen, weil Armut und Entwicklung nicht mehr getrennt von den großen Transformationsherausforderungen Klima, Biodiversität, Digitalisierung und künstliche Intelligenz betrachtet werden können. Entschuldige, jetzt unterbreche ich mich nochmal. Jörg, Sie haben keine Übersetzung. So irgendwie geht heute Abend alles nicht so am Schnürchen, wie wir es eigentlich sonst immer hier haben. Ich bitte um Verzeihung. I'm just asking for your translation. And we wait for a second. It doesn't make sense that you don't hear my introduction. Aber ich denke, Sie sind hier alle aus Interesse und Überzeugung und halten diese paar Minuten mit mir gemeinsam aus. Gut, ich fange dann nochmal von vorne an. Also heute Abend wollen wir über einen Vorschlag sprechen, der eine Alternative zum derzeitigen System der Entwicklungszusammenarbeit sein soll. Denn diese Entwicklungszusammenarbeit, die fälschlicherweise oft noch als Entwicklungshilfe bezeichnet wird, steht unter Druck. Zum einen, weil Armut und Entwicklung nicht mehr getrennt von den großen Transformationsherausforderungen unserer Zeit, Klima, Biodiversität, Digitalisierung, künstliche Intelligenz, um nur ein paar zu nennen, betrachtet werden können. Und zum anderen, weil die Welt heute zwar nach wie vor von großen Ungleichheiten und Einkommens- und Reichtumskonzentration geprägt ist, das wirtschaftliche Gewicht der Länder Asiens, Lateinamerikas und des Nahen Ostens und Afrikas aber gewachsen ist und seit 2008 das Gewicht der alten Industrieländer überschreitet. Und es hat auch eine deutliche Verringerung der Zahl der Menschen, die in extremer Armut leben, gegeben. Und das ist klar, das erfordert eine Veränderung der Inhalte, der Formen und der Institutionen der internationalen Zusammenarbeit. Im Lauf der letzten 60 Jahre hat sich die Entwicklungszusammenarbeit auch verändert und sich von der klassischen Wirtschaftsförderung auf weitere Ziele wie die Förderung von Demokratie und Menschenrechten, den Schutz der biologischen Vielfalt, Klimaschutz und Anpassung an den Klimawandel und die Prävention übertragbarer Krankheiten und auch andere globale öffentliche Güter ausgeweitet. Das funktioniert immer noch nicht. Ah, ja. Ah. Ja, also die Podiumsdiskussion machen wir ja auf Englisch. Ja? Und deswegen, es geht jetzt nur um die Einführung. Dann mache ich einfach weiter. Gut. Also ich sprach davon, wie sich die Entwicklungszusammenarbeit geändert hat. Aber, und Anna hat sie am Schluss ja auch noch sehr umfassende Ziele 2015 mit den Zielen für nachhaltige Entwicklung vereinbart. Aber, und das ist wichtig, eine Reform ihrer Institutionen, ihrer Zielsetzung, ihrer Begründung insgesamt blieb aus, sprang zu kurz oder orientierte sich stark auch an ökonomischen Eigeninteressen der Geberländer. Und nun, nach der Corona-Pandemie und mit der zweiten Präsidentschaft von Donald Trump, haben sich die politischen Rahmenbedingungen noch einmal fundamental geändert. Und wir erkennen, wie gut wir daran getan hätten, diese und andere Reformen nicht auf die lange Bank zu schieben. Womit haben wir es zu tun? Zum einen natürlich mit den Punkten der Rechtspopulisten, die EZ nach dem Motto „Meine Nation, meine Interessen zuerst“ kritisieren. Und das tun sie in Amerika, in Großbritannien oder in Deutschland, in anderen europäischen Ländern auch. Und lehnen internationale Solidarität grundsätzlich ab. Und dieser Diskurs stellt privilegierte Länder und ihre Bevölkerung wie uns als Opfer einer Aggression durch Außenstehende dar, durch Einwanderer, durch Nicht-Weiße und stellt damit grundsätzlich die Tatsache in Frage, dass reiche Länder wie das unsere ärmere Länder und Menschen unterstützen. Bis zu einem gewissen Grad war dieser Angriff erfolgreich, denn wir sehen, die Budgets für Entwicklung und globale öffentliche Güter werden in der gesamten westlichen Welt drastisch gekürzt, auch hier. Unter dem Druck dieser Art von Diskurs hat das deutsche Entwicklungsministerium eine neue Strategie entwickelt, die letzte Woche veröffentlicht wurde. Sie betont die strategische Ausrichtung der deutschen Entwicklungszusammenarbeit im Dienst der nationalen Interessen Deutschlands, auch im Dienst der Interessen deutscher Unternehmen, die künftig vor Beginn bilateraler Kooperationsgespräche mit Partnerländern konsultiert werden sollen. Es ist klar, dass Entwicklungszusammenarbeit schon immer zumindest teilweise von nationalen Interessen motiviert war und in manchen Phasen auch von aufgeklärten Interessen.
To combat climate change, promote human rights, I already told, which are the concrete challenges. So we can make a contribution, but it would be a wrong development to let them define the objectives, because you have to fix them, politically spoken, and it has to be in correspondence to the objectives which have been fixed. All people on the planet.
So sustainable development is a universal and planetarian responsibility, and every country and every society has to change and to invest in international cooperation. But there is another criticism on the so-called aid system that comes from a different angle and keeps on being adequate because developing countries, NGOs and critical scholars have long denounced the power imbalances between the so-called donors and recipients. And these imbalances allow donors to sometimes dictate conditions of cooperation, in particular the powerful multilateral development banks like the World Bank and the IMF have long been criticized for conditionalities that are tied to the discredited Washington consensus for prioritization, austerity, and the absence of industrial policy. And these imbalances lead also to the absence of true country ownership, often defined by foreign consultants and agencies. The concept of the global public investment was perceived and acted as a response to this criticism and is based on three simple, intuitively appealing principles. All countries benefit, all countries make a contribution according to their capacities, and all countries have a say. The funds are allocated based on the need, democratically, although we're trying to prioritize local impact that also generates global benefits, and international finance is then perceived as a mutual beneficial investment and not as a top-down process. This panel discussion has been organized on global public investment, and we organize it not only because we wanted to present this response. We think it's not the perfect solution for all the problems of the current system of development cooperation, but we do think that this concept really deserves further consideration, especially in the current moment, because what we need is a well-equipped and effective system of international public finance that is fit for the problems of the 21st century. And the recent developments, the backlash against development aid and the budget cuts in the last month have shown that the need for reform is greater than ever. But how do we do that? To what extent? What kind of reform? What concrete mechanisms are supposed to work in order to transform our current system of public finance. And this is something that we'd like to cover today in our discussion. And I'm really happy to count on our experts for the panel. But before I'd like to present our panelists, switching to English, I'd like to thank all my colleagues that have been preparing this event in the background, Christina Rode, Jörg Haas, Clara Ribbert, and Laima Lekevikiota. I hope I do pronounce her name right from our events management team. Thanks to all of you. And with that, I would like to ask my panelists to the stage. Now, first of all,
Thank you, Simon. Simon Reed Henry is professor at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo and a steering committee member at the Global Public Investment Network. He is an award-winning scholar of the political present, a thought leader and public speaker, and the author of 4 books translated into 7 languages. Born and educated in the UK, he gained his PhD from the University of Cambridge and studied fine arts in Montpellier, France, and he will introduce us to the concept of global public investment and its work. And I invite you to come to the lectern. And after we have listened to you, we all will come up here. And I see we have a 4th chair. Wonderful. Please, Simon.
Thank you, Irma. Thank you to the colleagues here at the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung for really bringing this conversation to Germany. It's a discussion we've been having in many corners of the world now for very many years, and I'm delighted that we can air some of our experiences and insights for you here tonight. Irma, as you were saying in your introductory comments, we are seeing not only the transformation, but for those of you following the headlines, the rupture, as Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, has put it, of the international order as we know it. Now, in this context, it's more important than ever that governments are able to cooperate, to finance, to secure, and to govern shared global challenges. We live on one planet. We can't escape this fact. It's up to us to find ways to protect it and to build in it productively, socially, and through our communities together. Even without all that's happening in the world of international affairs these last months, the last year, the limits to government's capacity to do this, to build together, to share and cooperate around global challenges, was already apparent. It was apparent during the recent COVID-19 pandemic, you remember? Feels some time ago now. It was apparent during the last year of cuts to international aid, not just from the US, but in many countries around the world, many traditional donor countries beginning to cut their aid budgets. The OECD DAC, as an institution, has been monitoring and shows us that really already in 2023 we had reached what some scholars call peak aid, the point at which international development assistance reached its highest level. It's been on a decline since then. We anticipate the decline will continue. But that decline is not simply because of governments not putting in the money. It's declined as well because ODA was already a smaller part of a much larger international financial architecture, a financial architecture that encompasses everything from remittances sent home from migrants who've moved abroad, which at a level of just under 600 billion vastly outdwarfs what ODA levels anyway have been, even in their peak period. And it includes at the other end of the spectrum perhaps the work of a new multilateral development system organized through the multilateral development banks who have grown and who are increasingly cooperating together to find ways of financing global challenges. So peak aid had arrived, but already the system had moved on. And not only the system, but the world in which we all live. Because the world for which ODA, the development assistance framework, was established, the world of the post-Second World War era, has long since left us. The institutions that we have to cooperate are institutions inherited from the 20th century, from a completely different situation than the one we encounter today. So what are the institutions of the future that we require to allow us to cooperate now in the present to ensure we have a planet to live on in 100 years' time? That's the question that global public investment seeks to address. And the reason it does so are simple. The existing structures of ODA were anyway a limited channel. From some countries, OECD DAC is around 34 countries, to another smaller group of countries. Planetary crises, pandemics, climate, these are all challenges that vastly exceed the capacity of any one nation to address alone, but they are also transboundary problems. They are complex. They spread from one country to another. Diseases do not respect borders. So how do we address these problems if all we have is a hammer, and that is not the nail? What are we to do? The fundamental reality that the world has been waking up to over the last 12 months has been that the world requires a different system. Now, this does not mean that ODA is not viable and valuable and can fulfill an important role in supporting the reduction of poverty in those countries where poverty remains. But if you look at the trends, you have seen that over the last decades, we have moved from 40% of the world living in poverty to now just 10%. These are elements of progress to be celebrated, but they also leave out of the picture a whole category of challenge that all of us confront today, and that if we do not also address, then we will see poverty return. So this is not a decision that we can escape. It's one we have to embrace, and this is why the idea of global public investment was born out of those critiques of the traditional system, as you mentioned, Imma, but also out of a hope and a desire to build forward together to address the challenges of the 21st century. So what if we were to reimagine, as it says here, the system of international public finance, not around a model of charity, which has been the driving political force, the narrative, if you like, of ODA over the last few decades, but around the principle of mutuality? What would that system look like? One answer is to look to what national federal systems of financing have always been. That some countries can send money to other countries, but there are also areas where they share. That not everybody has the monopoly on development, that not every country is itself developed. We are all, in effect, developing. This is the evolution of public finance nationally that we've seen in countries over the last 200 years. It's the evolution we now need at the international level. And this does not need to come at the expense of ODA, as I say. What it does need to do is to be additional to ODA. It needs to tap into new resource flows. And fortunately, amid the political instability of our times, we are also seeing a flourishing of new ideas about how that can come about. New ideas around global solidarity levies, where we can tax not simply country A to pay for country B, but we can tax the wealthy wherever they may be, to help finance the needs of the poor wherever they may be. That we can address the global public bads that often generate the profits that need to be returned into a world where we can support the global public goods, but only if we do so through public conditionality. And by that, I mean the opposite of the conditionality we saw in the 1980s, where countries were required by institutions housed in the global north to follow certain rules that were of the devising of the global north. I'm talking about a form of conditionality that safeguards the public and the returns to the public of investments that need to be made in infrastructure, in services, and in core systems, core functions that the world and its citizens require to live successfully together. So implementing global public investment, implementing this new system, has to involve some changes. But those changes don't mean we have to start from scratch. We build on the system that we have, and we reform it in line with the principles, all contribute, all benefit, all get to decide, that we need to enable this system to function. And that requires two evolutions. It requires an evolution of narrative, and it requires an evolution of institutions. On the narrative, what we want is in 20 years' time, people to be talking completely differently about how we finance global common challenges. We want them to be sharing ideas. We want to see a flourishing of innovations and new possibilities for addressing the challenges of climate, of health, of social protection. This is the world we want to see. It's a narrative in which countries will get to decide. And when we bring countries into that collectively, when we remove the power of the donor to be alone the one deciding what the agenda needs to be, we will find that better decisions are made. So the narrative that we wish to see is a democratized narrative, and one which we therefore believe will be a better and a more convincing narrative to enable governments to explain to their citizens why these things are worth investing in, just as we do when we pay our taxes nationally. And institutionally, the evolution that we require is about the gradual multilateralism of international public finance, moving it out of some existing organizational structures where it's been housed for decades and into more democratic frameworks where these countries can be invited in, and not just countries, because countries do not always best represent their citizens. We also need seats at the table for communities and for civil society. And many of these are innovations that we've seen in existing public finance arrangements. The Global Fund, for example, to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria, has pioneered the bringing in of Global North and Global South, rich and poor countries, into its governance framework. It's pioneered, along with other funds, such as the Pandemic Fund, the idea of having civil society seats on those same boards. But these are small drops in an ocean of the change that we need to see. What we need to see is these governance reforms taking place at the level of the framework itself, so that governments can, in good faith and legitimately, talk to each other about how they finance the huge gap. We talk about the difference between the billions and the trillions. We talk about an SDG funding gap, 2.5 billion. How do we fill that gap? For a long time, the answer has been we wait for the private sector to move in. But the private sector often won't move in, at least until the public sector has led the way. This is why we need to focus not just on the global of global public investment, but also on the public of global public investment. We need to ensure that the investments and the generation of investable projects through public financing is something that all governments can contribute to and all can potentially benefit from. And I'll say one last thing about the nature of GPI that's different to ODA. And that is the fact that in this system too, we ought to be able to invest wherever we want. The conditions that we apply, the conditionality we apply, public or otherwise, needs to apply to rich countries as well as poor countries. There needs to be universality in the principles, and there needs to be universality in the implementation of those principles through the structures of governance. That is a huge difference, but it's not an impossible difference. And it's one reason why, in collaboration with our colleagues at the Club de Madrid and the Development Bank of Latin America and the Caribbean, we were delighted last summer in Seville during the 4th Financing for Development Conference, which was held under the auspices of the UN, to launch a Seville, as it's called, platform for action, where over the next 3 years we will be bringing together a coalition of governments and international organizations, a coalition of the willing, if you like, to discuss these ideas, to try how they may work, to consult and to convene, to understand regionally how they need to work, and then to begin to pilot some of the implications of them. And we hope and believe that over 3 years, we will be able to demonstrate proof of concept of this transformative idea to feed into the larger discussion about where the international financial architecture needs to go in the post-2030 agenda. Because as we decide how our world needs to look after 2030, when the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, finally finish, many, of course, which will be unmet, we need to decide that what is required is no longer a series of goals, but a new system for ensuring that any goals that we decide democratically are met. That's the transformation that we think global public investment can bring. It's what we're working with our partners, using their capacity to bring together both the intelligence of the banks and the political capital of former democratic leaders who understand how these processes work, so that we can create a safe space for collaboration and innovation and co-creation of this idea beyond simply a policy framework into an actual policy reality. It's exciting to be here in Germany talking about these things where there has been so much innovation in these spheres. Germany is now, with USAID cuts, I think the largest donor internationally. So using that responsibility, how do we build a new system where those funds can be put to work in new ways, where we can make them go further and make them reach more and more individuals around the world and fulfill their needs? We believe that these two evolutions, narrative evolutions, institutional evolutions will ultimately lead to more money because we will be expanding the donor base, and it will lead to better money because we will be democratizing the decision-making processes. And any of you who've sat and argued around a dinner table will agree that the best decision is the one you all reach at the end of the argument, not the one you thought of yourself when you went in. That's what we need internationally as well, and it's why I think that this should also lead to more dignified relations between countries, and wouldn't that be a nice thing? Ime, thank you so much for the invitation to speak today, and I look forward to the conversation we'll have with our colleagues here now. Thank you.
Thank you. So please have a seat. And I would like to invite Adolf Kluke-Lesch and Maria Elena Agüero to come upstairs also. So I have presented Simon already, so I will present our other two panelists. So Maria Elena Agüero is the Secretary General of the Club de Madrid. And the Club de Madrid is the world's largest forum of democratic former presidents and prime ministers who leverage their individual and collective leadership experience and global reach to strengthen inclusive democratic practice and improve the well-being of people around the world. Must be a very interesting group you are dealing with, Maria Elena. And then we have Adolf Kluke-Lesch. He is a former ministerial director at BMZ and an associate researcher at the German Institute of Development and Sustainability. That is where we met years ago. And Adolf, you are looking back at a very long career in very different positions in German development cooperation. You have been nearly at all spaces. I think only KfW is a place where you never went to. And you have done a lot of work founding the German section of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. And now you continue at IDOS. So welcome to you all. And we listened to your description of the justification for this new approach to international cooperation and public finance. And how, I would like to ask you the same question here. How would you see GPI being implemented in practice? How would this look like? So what would you actually expect from your SPA, from your pilot? I would like to start with Maria Elena and then Adolf and then Simon.
Talk? Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Ime. Thank you very much to the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung and to colleagues in the panel, and especially to Simon Reed-Henry and of course GPIN, the Global Public Investment Network. That is one of the questions that we will be answering in this collaboration and in this space of time. There is, as Simon explained, a commitment that was made in Seville during the 4th Conference on Financing for Development. And what we would like to see and what we're aiming for as we collaborate in this coalition of governments, because they are the decision makers today, but also with the multilateral institutions, especially the multilateral financial institutions, to try to identify specific projects, specific instances where this approach, this new way of investment, this new way of transforming what is very much needed in terms of development cooperation, and including, as we heard just a minute ago, including not just that cooperation from the north to the south, but also in the north and with the south. It's not just a top-down exercise that we're looking at, and we'd like to identify pilot opportunities, pilot possibilities that we can work on where this approach, where this way of looking at cooperation and working on cooperation can take place. There are examples, as Simon was citing earlier, where this has been and is being implemented in different ways, and the health sector is one where we see this both in the Global Fund and in the Pandemic Fund. But it's going beyond that. It's looking at the global public, again emphasizing the two terms, global public goods, and looking at it not as aid, not as charity, but as investments. And in that sense, we think that it is something that in the current state of affairs, it is a way of looking at cooperation that can also be more effective, bring other partners and other actors into the equation.
Yeah, thank you, Imme, for inviting me, and thank you both of you to be with us today. I think it's very important, and I have to admit that I have been a fan of GPI since quite some time, so I see it as the only game in town, so to speak, that gives us a viable narrative or a viable option for a world beyond ODA. And Simon has already made it clear how much has changed in the world. I just want to add that with the West gone, also the North is gone, and also the South is gone. So we live in a completely different world nowadays. And there are many actors in the former, I have to say, global South, middle powers, middle income countries, which are eager to play a role in the global cooperation architecture. Not only at the receiving end, but also at the contributing end, and in particular by framing the future architecture. And that is a very basic idea I find so fascinating with this. And as was said, we need to understand that we have shared problems, and the solutions for these problems do not sit on one side of the table. Remember the pandemic. The efficiency by which governments dealt with the pandemic didn't correlate positively with the per capita income of the countries. There were significant failures in rich countries, and there was significant success in poorer countries. And there are many, many other instances where we can learn from each other, and where change can be introduced also in higher middle income countries and high income countries by embracing innovations and advice from poorer places. And I think that is the fundamental change that is possible with this narrative. I mean, you asked how to implement it. Definitely, that is not an easy question, because we have this huge multilateral cooperation architecture, and that cannot be changed by a fiat. In the end, we will need to follow two ways. The one is to inject the GPI narrative as much as possible into existing structures, knowing about all the past dependencies, all the institutional inertia, but we need to do so. And there is some progress with emerging institutions, and there is participation, so that is an option. And I think the United Nations Development System could be one way forward. But we also need to set up institutions that are completely modeled around the GPI narrative pure, because otherwise nobody would understand how it works. And that may be in the end a group of 10 to 15 countries who start with that, maybe around one or two topics. It could be also a region-to-region approach. So there are different pathways forward, but I think we have to move into that direction and need to overcome the fundamental dilemmas of the donor-recipient architecture. And just as you asked for examples, we have this with the Pandemic Preparedness Fund, where Also, our dear friend Christoph Benn is working hard to implement GPI. There is a lot of GPI thinking already implemented there, but I would like to draw also to the attention the New Development Bank, which was initiated by China, or the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. Actually, these banks invest in all countries. They invest in China, in Russia. I don't want to discuss it politically, but they invest in South Africa, in Brazil, in India. And the Asia Infrastructure and Investment Bank now invests even beyond Asia, in many places, even in higher income countries. So a completely different approach. And the Belt and Road Initiative of China isn't limited to poor places. That reaches out up to Europe. So there are other actors who already have moved beyond the traditional narrative. And I think it is for us in Europe, and I want to make this point of Europe very strong in the very beginning, it is the question whether we are up to the situation and to come forward with a new model that moves beyond the US-led global cooperation architecture. We have made ourselves comfortable in that architecture, but now we need to be standing on our own feet.
Yeah, thank you, Adolf. Now, this sounds very much state and government oriented so far, and I would like you, in your answer, Simon, to maybe dwell also on how participation of civil society and other actors could be organized, because the answers to problems also change when there is a broader participation, a broader dialogue, especially also from the perspective of justice.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. And I think you're right. I agree with what both Maria-Elena and Adolf have mentioned. The Global Public Investment Network is itself a civil society organization, and as a prelude to the answer to you, I would say that also a lot of the solutions and thinking about how to address these challenges comes from civil society, let alone thinking of civil society as an implementing party. But it's true, governments alone do not always adequately represent the interests of their populations. Anybody who studies democracy will know the turnout figures and how much really any one government represents the full range of its citizens' needs. There are governments where some citizens are actively not included in decision-making or their interests taken into account. But those countries also confront problems, and those people also have needs that need addressing. So I think having civil society is key. Many of us in civil society have been pushing for a long time for civil society representation in the existing international financial architecture. That's been much easier to achieve in some of the vertical funds of the last 10, 20 years. We mentioned the Global Fund on AIDS, TB and Malaria. We could mention Gavi and others where civil society has a voice and is able to influence decision-making. At the same time, it's a further challenge, if you like, when you move from a single fund to a framework, to an international cooperation system. Now there, the answer to the question of how you implement it has to turn on three things. It has to turn on figuring out how you pay in, how you resource this thing. Secondly, figuring out how you spend the money, on what you spend the money. And thirdly, figuring out how you decide what to prioritize, because we can never fund everything. And those three elements are all addressed in any number of, you could do this at the macro level through the development banks, in which case you have to reform those institutions to be able to represent all countries' universal contributions we talk about in the ways that's required. Or you can do it at a micro and opt-in scale, as you were referring to, Adolf, where some countries decide to lead on this issue anyway. Now that can happen regionally, because there you often have 3 or 4 governments or countries that share a common border or a common issue. I'm thinking of rainforest regions, protection of those, biodiversity. Those are areas where you could see governments coming together and through the principles of global public investment beginning to address their challenges in new ways. You can also think of region-to-region cooperation. So I often try to steer people a little bit away from this word global, which often sounds very vast and very hard to manage, and especially at times like now, a little bit off-putting, to actually really what global breaks down to. And global breaks down to institutions and their own rules and procedures. And that's why I say there are these 2 evolutions. We have the institutional change, and then we have the narrative change that has to power that institutional state, that institutional change, by giving governments reason to believe this could work and reason to convince their own citizens that this could work.
Yes, briefly.
Yeah. No, just, I don't know where it is.
Which-
Thank you. No, I just, bueno, it's going everywhere. Sorry. In what Simon just said in response to your question, I think that it sort of explains a bit of why the Club of Madrid and GPIN are partnering. Because the Club of Madrid is a network, if you wish, it is also a group of over 100 democratic former presidents and prime ministers who have the experience of decision-making, the experience of having led their governments. But today they are very much civil society. They are citizens with a different kind of experience than we have, but that some of us have, but very definitely they are civil society. And as two civil society bodies with different, one GPIN with more of the technical and the theoretical, but also the practical experience, coming together with the political leaders that have the practical experience, as I said, of decision making, but that can also access today's governments and today's leaders in a different way. It's what gives us, we think and we hope, a different strength in terms of this of trying to establish this coalition of governments and multilateral or international organizations. And it's important in making it very clear that it's not just a technical discussion, but it is very much a real life and real people discussion. And trying to access those that are making decisions today is vital. Thank you.
Yeah, my next question refers to the relationship between GPI and South-South cooperation. The first two governments which supported your joint initiative are Colombia and Uruguay, if I rightly remember. And that is interesting because probably it would have been preferable to have a combination of North and South. We say it does not exist anymore, but in fact, the world is still divided in those groupings. So my question actually now is, how would you position GPI versus South-South cooperation? Adriana Abdennour, she is from leading a foreign policy. She led a foreign policy think tank in Brazil and now has her own new outfit. And she has advised President Lula from Brazil during the first part of his presidency, especially in during the BRICS presidency. And she defines South-South cooperation as grounded in sovereignty, mutual benefit, non-interference, and win-win outcomes. Is that a full description of GPI? Or, and what would you, and I'm also asking this because I remember when South-South cooperation re-emerged, I would say, in the 2000s, 10s, around that time, it was created explicitly to create an own space of the South and keep the North outside. And it was quite a battle to have other actors actually being present in the meetings of these groups, so that it was very much government controlled and dominated. Science entered, think tanks entered, but civil society did not have a very strong entry there, as far as I can see. So how would you see the relationship between these two concepts? Maybe we start with you, Simon, but maybe I also would like to open to questions from you, from the public. So maybe we can have short answers.
I'll be brief. I think partly because really the only part missing from that description you gave of South-South cooperation is the North. And that's something we have to build towards. The history of South-South cooperation in its genesis and in the principles that animate it is very closely aligned with GPI. We talk maybe of circular cooperation, or others talk of triangular cooperation, and that does bring the North in. Portugal, for example, is a country that is very engaged in these things, also a donor country from the North. but not one of the traditional donor countries, and one that recognizes that the things we need to cooperate on is not simply money. You know, money is important, but it's also about sharing knowledge, about sharing understanding of what we can do to change things together, and it's about sharing capacities, you know, whether that's technology, or whether it's actually really about breaking down the challenges of regulation and all of the institutional elements of the international financial architecture that shape what governments are able to do, rather than being able to actually be a question of how governments are able to do it. So the rules by which governments invest are as important in a way as the money they invest with. And South-South cooperation is much stronger on addressing those issues of the rules, which is what we in GPI are also saying is part of the problem. We need new rules, new frameworks, and new principles. It's not just about getting more money on the table, it's about how we get the money on the table.
Thank you. Maria-Elena?
And it's also about what we bring to the table, and you refer to that. I mean, it's not just, I think, behind South-South cooperation, there wasn't that much money involved, but everything else. It was sharing knowledge, as you say, it was sharing the experiences, and at least my recollection is not that it was that much about money. And it's interesting that you refer to how Adriana Betancourt describes this, because it is in many ways also very much what we see and what we are putting on the table regarding global public investment. But it also includes an element that is very important and that is not always highlighted, and that's the non-interference element. Because cooperation has and could engage in interfering, and we have seen that in the past. And that is something that is an important element to keep in mind as we develop an approach, a way, a system of cooperation that can be shared and that can be more, at least we think, much more effective in reaching its objectives and reaching the people.
Well, on South-South cooperation, I think there's many things that are romanticized in a way, or idealized. I think we need also to be realistic about that. I think what is the main element that is important in relation to GPI is that sharing experiences between southern countries would be systematically built in a GPI architecture, while the ODI architecture was sharing knowledge from the north to the south. But having a GPI platform, it would be a collective sharing of experiences between south-south, between north-north, from south to north, and everything comes together. That is really a knowledge bank then, what the World Bank would like to be. But GPI could actually be that in a much better way. On the reality of South-South cooperation, I think there is a lot of interference. There is, in most cases, I would say, the traditional aid paradigm that one country is giving and the other is receiving. And this becomes even more prominent with the big southern countries that are emerging economies, or really now developed economies like China, but also India, Brazil, and so forth. And I don't see that the cooperation, for example, between Tanzania and India would imply any role for Tanzania in China or in India. So this circularity I don't see in the present system. And also the triangular cooperation suffers from the fact that the North is only to finance the transfer from the middle-income country to the low-income country. So we need to be a little bit realistic about that, but I think the basic approach that southern countries share experience is best served within a GPI context.
So now my last question to you three is, we are now living in a world where the news cycle is dominated by Donald Trump and his latest action. And for example, with a stroke of a pen, he has pulled the United States out of a large number of international organizations, or he creates a substitute for the UN dominated by him personally and by personal loyalty. And this is just to trying to describe the current political climate. So how do you assess the prospects of the concept of GPI progressing under these conditions? I mentioned it a bit in my introduction in saying, well, we are in a very critical juncture. And of course, in times where everything seems to be questioned, there are spaces emerge for innovation. But it feels a bit difficult to be very optimistic in this moment. So I would like to hear your assessment. What would be the structural differences actually in the factors which may create new spaces for change? Marilena, do you want to start this time?
Well, there I'd say that the word itself of global public investment may be more attractive in the narrative and better understood. But the truth is that we have been speaking about, for example, social impact investment for some time now. So it's not that new as a concept. But I think in the current context, what we have to try to do is to be as open as possible in listening to the different views and in trying to reach out to as broad a universe of countries from the north, from the south, whether that exists or not, but whatever and whichever systems they may have, but to try to bring them on board the acceptance of this new approach, new way of addressing development cooperation, but cooperation in general as well.
Yeah, Adolf, please, and then Simon, you close that round.
Yeah, well, in these times of rupture, I think we need to acknowledge that we are not going to see a unified global cooperation architecture in the future. So the Western-dominated multilateral system is fragmenting. Other actors are emerging, as I mentioned, with New Development Bank and other things. So GPI can only add to that multiple orders an additional element that might be more attractive as a US-centered, China-centered, Russia-centered cooperation architecture. And it is in a way a counter-narrative, very much needed in these days. Many people in the development community tend to feel under attack and then retreat to a niche and defend the good old days. And I think the only way forward is to leave that niche and to imagine something new. And in this context, I would like to come back to Europe. I think Simon mentioned the European burden-sharing model. In Europe, all countries contribute 1% to the European budget. All countries benefit from them according to necessities. And there are net contributors and net recipients. But even Germany had to present its 25 billion euro program for overcoming COVID to the European Commission. And it was sent back to Berlin to get reworked. So the German benefit of this was under the same scrutiny as the one by Greece or by Italy. Why couldn't we turn this internal burden sharing and allocation formula outside to our partners of choice, or to propose to offer them to co-create new region-to-region systems, for example with the Mercosur or with the African Union or our immediate neighborhood. I think there is a practical model within Europe which is very much following the GPI philosophy. And I think that is the way forward, and we should be ambitious as Europeans to present something new to the world that doesn't follow the other big players.
Thank you. Simon.
Thank you. I'm encouraged by this word up here, hope. I think unless in this current moment we can be hopeful, we really won't achieve anything. And not only will we be not worried about the things we haven't built, we'll be worried about the things that have been taken away from us while we were thinking about it. I'm absolutely convinced of the fact that in practical terms, we are one country. You know, in the same way that fiscally federal states don't send education money from one part of the country to another part of the country and receive health budget monies back in return. Internationally, there are all things along the lines, as you said, of South-South cooperation that we can give and that we can receive and that we need to, because we're not all the masters of our own houses. And I think once we have, in a sense, got our head out of that mindset, the narrative part, we are then able to build the institutional part. And this is really why with our coalition, I think we have the vehicle that we need to drive this idea to the next stage. It's like a rocket. We've had 10, 15 years in some cases for some of us of talking about this idea. That's the beginning stage. And now we have a coalition that's going to take us to the next stage. You know, and if you think about how rockets go up, they use most of their fuel on the first 15 yards. You know, that's where most of it goes. And then as you begin to exit gravity, things start to go quicker. Then those coalitions of the willing can begin to make an impression in their different spheres. If we can have just a few governments agreeing the terms of what this looks like, and one of those governments can raise its hand in a G20 or a G7 and put those ideas concretely on the table, the political opportunities will come to us. You know, I'm a big fan of the phrase, build it and they will come. But we need to be ready. And that's why we need, through the coalition and with the support of governments, hopefully in Germany and hopefully elsewhere, we can take this idea to the next stage and be ready for those moments when they arrive. So I'm actually hopeful, despite the challenges of the moment, but also to some extent because of them.
Thank you. So now is your turn. Have you questions or comments you would like to bring in? Are you all under the... there is one hand over there.
Good evening. My name is Thomas Buczkowski. I'm a freelance journalist and photographer. Thank you, first of all, for presenting the ideas and the concepts. After you've been talking about hope, I'm asking you to be a bit more poetic about the whole thing. Could you give us an idea in an ideal mindset and an ideal development? How would this concept look in, let's say, 25 years? What would be the outcome? What would be the bodies who would be driving the whole system? How would that work in an ideal system? Be a bit poetic, and please keep in mind, for example, we've been talking about COVID. I've been in Brazil at the time of COVID, and I saw that even the president was working against the other governments, the local governments, and they had a lot of time fighting with each other. You know that there was a lot of turmoil in a country that used to work very well with infections and diseases, and suddenly it broke down. So be having in mind that systems can fail at any time because of any persons, any incidents. But what would be your poetic look into the future? Well, I'm not even talking about the issue of corruption, but that would be my request. My request for you, just to make it a bit more clearer, the outcome which you are aiming for. Please. Thank you very much.
This question you addressed to Simon? Okay.
So with the caveat that it's for governments to decide, not me, what I would, and thanks, it's a great question, it's a good provocation. I would envisage a world where through multi-annual budget cycles, governments, civil society, the relevant stakeholders come together to recognize and decide what the priorities are in that period, Edolf was talking a little bit about the EU budget. Imagine, to some extent, that globalized, recognizing, as I said before, the caveat that the global is a very large and disparate terrain, that not every single country is going to be a part of these things anyway, and nor does it need to be. But we would still nonetheless have a system that works through the international financial architecture. The bank, the World Bank, would be modified to adjust to these things. The MDBs would be talking to the national development banks, where actually most of the money is based. And we would have public investment in things that are needed within countries. We would have public investment and guardrails to address the challenge of exactly one government going rogue, not supporting some of its citizens, so that there are criteria and there are constraints around how you use the money. We often use the word conditionality in development terms as if it's sort of a dirty word, because we have historic experiences that show how that can be misused. But I have no problem with public conditionality, making sure that public funds are used in reliable and transparent and meaningful ways. And that's the system that I would see in 20, 30 years' time. Now, of course, a lot can happen. But I'll say one thing, which is that a system that is more universal is much less vulnerable to the exit of, say, one country, a particularly powerful country perhaps, that can then create this concatenation of further challenges where money gets pulled out of the system because it's so essential. I would want to see a world where one country, where we're not at the mercy of one country or any grouping of countries. That would be a big change. And if it's poetic to talk about how, you know, the bank and the multilateral development bank system could be used, then that's poetry of its own sort. But I want to see those principles embedded in the institutional architecture. I'm a little more open as to how the institutional architecture and which pieces of it come together, because I think that will depend which countries get it off the ground and how they bring in that first round of prioritization of what we're going to work on. So that would be my answer.
Not very poetic, but still hopeful. I actually had thought that there would be more need to ask questions or make comments. If that, yeah, there is someone. Okay, yeah.
Thank you. My name is Katharina Anton-Axleben. I'm currently an independent consultant in international development. I've done a lot of work for USAID in the US and across Africa as well, and just returned to Berlin. First of all, thank you so much for this important and timely and fascinating discussion. My question is, I'm curious to know a little bit more about how Global South actors or representatives of the countries that used to be recipients of aid are not only being brought into the discussion, but are actually leading on this discussion. To what extent is this discussion following what people, not just governments, but civil society actors as well, in those countries are actually demanding? How are they imagining a new system?
Adolf, you want to answer this?
I think it would be better to have Henry answering this. As I learned from the conversation with the GPI system network, and I participated in quite a number of online meetings, this is think tanks, civil society, and even governments around the globe, with the South representing the majority of the discussants. But maybe you can work in more detail on it.
No, I mean, this is what they're calling for. You know, what we need now is the vehicle, the platform for them to do so formally and not simply through us as a civil society channel. But I mean, take Africa as a region. There are numerous initiatives there. The Accra Reset in terms of health governance and the desire of governments there to be able to. We talked about sovereignty earlier on in your question, Emma. Health sovereignty is a key concern for those governments. They don't want to be vulnerable to external forces in terms of financing their own health systems. So the Accra Reset as well is a part of that wider agenda. Then there are initiatives being launched by the African Development Bank about bringing clean and affordable energy to every single household. That's a primary concern, but it's an African concern, and it's one that they want to bring in and are absolutely happy to bring in other financing sources into that solution. But they need this larger narrative for that to be a meaningful ask. And I think if we're going to build beyond just regional solutions to regional problems, then we need this language, this cooperation framework embedded in these principles where that can happen. And from that will come, greater impact, greater effectivity, and all those development concerns that we have, not through the language of ODA, but through the language of investment in the things that people really need.
You wanted to add something?
Yeah, it's an important question you put in front of us. As we discussed this in Berlin with a northern panel, not having a southern representative here, it seems like another brainchild of the north. But it is not only the north that is trapped in these old past dependencies, it is also the south. The global cooperation architecture, you have the southern countries who actually play the role of recipients, and many defend this role. And to move beyond that role needs also quite some change in the southern part of our globe. And I would make, as Henry referred to the time beyond 2030, to the problem of the means of implementation. The nice 2030 agenda, which I love so much, has 26 means of implementation. A third of them addressed to all countries, universal. But the majority of them is also universal, but focused on implementation in developing countries. And not one means of implementation is geared towards implementation in richer countries. And that reflects this lopsided architecture we are in. We will not solve our global problems without change also in the richer countries, not only because of the spillover effects, be it climate and others, but also because of our societal problems. If we don't solve them, then the preparedness to engage for global issues will diminish further. So we need change in richer countries, and therefore we need a change, we need the role of the multilateral system and the role of southern countries in our domestic politics. It is difficult to imagine, but in the end we need it. We have the interference by the global system in all our partner countries, day and night, for decades. We have a little bit of this with the treaty bodies in Geneva. So when the disability pact is implemented and then an observer comes to Germany and looks, or whether we follow the migration and refugee frameworks. But there's nothing regarding transformation. And solidarity and transformation cannot be shaped as a one-way street. And therefore we need to change this.
Well, we have, thank you. We have a question over here.
Yeah, I'm Jörg Haas. I'm working here at the Böll Foundation. And actually my background is very much in the climate governance space. And climate is another arena where I would say there is a very entrenched structure of the discussion, which originally has its origin in the desire for justice. To recognize the huge differences in the responsibility and the capability, the principle of the convention, etc., etc. But it led to a duality of countries. It led to the north, who has to pay, and it has the south, who will receive. A bit, very, very simplified. And it's being defended tooth and nail in the negotiations. And the progressive NGOs defend it tooth and nail. and that's part of the problem. And I think with a morally justifiable motivation, etc., etc. But I think at the same time, it's becoming a problem in a world which is changing very fast, and which is and that's what I find very attractive in GPI. Can we come to a system that is dynamic in its application, that is simple in its principle, but dynamic in its application and adaptable to a rapidly changing world?
I will collect, now there's another question over here. No, but no. For the translators are still working.
Okay, I don't, maybe I'm now a little bit nasty and pour some water into the wine. I'm a little bit disappointed from the discussion this evening because you are still very much on the macro level. And I'm in the development cooperation now for more than 40 years as an independent advisor and consultant. And a lot of things you are thinking which need to be supported, they are there already. I think you have to step down from your macro level one step and look what is going on already for more than 40 years. I still remember it was in West Africa in 1983-84. I was evaluating a self-help network in Senegal. And these farmers had already an exchange with farmers in India. So it is there. Step down and listen to these these associations or these self-help networks which are there already. When I came back from Senegal in those days, I still remember the discussions here in Germany. They were asking me, oh, is this now Bauerntourismus, farmers' tourism going from Africa to India? It was nasty, it was arrogant, but this is exactly what we need now, and this is what you are discussing now, and we should think how we could support this level. Yes, and if they need some financial support, then we should not talk about farmers' tourism between India and West Africa. But these are already there for 40 years. I don't know what has happened to this network, but I followed it up for more than 20 years, and it was still there. So this is my little water into your wine tonight.
Okay, so we have two very different questions and comments. There's another one here.
Ich habe jetzt gerade das Mikrofon.
Ach, da. Okay.
Soll ich das zurückhalten? Should I save the question for now?
No, we will do a little bit of overtime then because we started late. So your question.
I don't really need to ask that question. I mean, okay. Hello to the panel. Thank you very much. I'm Tim Giesecke. I'm a law student, not in public international law though. And I guess my question revolves around the narrative part of the discussion, because I think some of the issues at hand are rather time sensitive, and it takes time to change a narrative if you want to do it by rational discourse and not in a top-down manner. So my question, I guess, would be, how do you think you want to change the narrative? Is it going to be easier because you don't have to change a society, but maybe only convince a few head of states to change their opinion about it? Or because not even a rupture like the already touched upon corona crisis did change narratives in the global development discourse. So how do you want to tackle that issue, I guess, is my question.
Okay, and then over here. You. Mm-hmm. Which one? The lady first, because we are in the green, and then...
Yes. Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm Ellen Hasp. I'm studying political sciences, and I had a similar question. That's why I wanted to raise it, because I was asking myself how, if you are building on this existing institutional landscape with the money donors, which are the existing development banks, of course they will be modified or also like put into this framework, but how will you make sure that this principle of mutual benefits and also non-interference, which has been a challenge in the whole history of development cooperation, how will this be put into practice if we have, like, in reality, like those huge power gaps? Yeah.
Thank you very much to the panel for the very interesting discussion. And I would like to also add a little comment to the two previous comments that have been made before, or maybe three. I feel like this is a great idea on how it sounds and everything. But I feel like if we think about it, we're kind of ignoring, like we're saying that this would be possible in, I think that Simon said that like 20, 30 years from now. And I think in this way, we're kind of ignoring how the last 20, 30 years looked on the political landscape a little bit. That's at least how I feel, because I think the previous person, I think you also said something about like we have like big power gaps. And I'm thinking also we have like those countries, like let's name just US and Russia, for example, that are like actively involved in military forces right now across the globe. And I just feel like those countries like that, especially the leaders of those countries and the existing structures and the existing mindset maybe, that also spreads on the people obviously living in those countries. I'm not really sure how these like global humanistic interests are actually going to be put into practice with those things existing. Thank you.
Yeah, bringing us back to reality.
Yeah, thank you. Werner Niedelde. I'm not really involved in international cooperation, but I was always very emotionally invested. And looking at the development in countries and where people are giving money to in final idea to support their own economy. And I was also waiting for some development which goes in this direction. And in light of the last statements, I would like to ask you, what's the path to involve people on the ground and investments and initiatives that already exist? How do you want to go forward to reach this 25, 30 years from now and to reach a system which is based on, I think you will need everybody and everyone and every initiative to go there.
Okay, thank you. So you really woke up now in the end. Thank you. We have 6 questions, and I will mention them now, and then I would go through you, but you please pick your questions. And the one who speaks last has to give the answers to those which haven't been answered. Okay, so we start then with Adolf and then Maria-Elena, and then Simon will have to finish it off. So we had the question about the farmers' associations in Senegal and India is a bit similar to your point also, how to bring in initiatives from bottom up and mobilize also this energy and make this new system stimulate that, actually. I brought them together, so maybe it's only one question. The question Jörg Haas asked, I would say on the example of climate finance, how would GPI effectively mobilize a sufficient amount of finance from the various sources which are supposed to pay into GPI, into the funding, and therefore allow also to move away from this confrontational situation. The other way around, we could ask: is it really possible to put how to make so much pressure on the richer, still richer countries to fulfill their share in the funding, to fill the funding gap? We have not been very successful in that in these last years. And then how to deal with the power the development banks, be them in the south or in the north, have, so that they really support sensible projects and do not use their power for negative interferences. And a similar question is about how to counteract the large powers who use force and don't show interest in the public good, but only in their only focus on their own interest and their own forthcoming. So we start with you, and again, brief as possible, as brief as possible.
Yes, thank you. These are all very important questions. Hannelore, on the farmers, I think GPI would be well advised to work also for an NGO window, so to speak, so that funds could be also applied for by non-governmental initiatives. And I assume that this is already in the concepts, but I think that is necessary because GPI is only a multilateral or plurilateral system. It cannot work on a bilateral basis. And therefore, to make sure that it's not only government-driven, this second window would be necessary. On the power gaps, well, there is still power gaps, but we have to realize that the power gap globally is narrowing. The South is catching up quite significant. And therefore, I think we also have to recognize this changing power landscape, and that also relates to mobilizing money. Definitely, it would be nice to have, for example, the oil exporting countries from the Gulf region also to contribute to GPI. We know that there's certain interest in countries like Indonesia to make a contribution to a system that is not just a northern system. So the hesitation by the emerging powers just to finance the old system is understandable. And therefore, there should be something new. And I would like to pass on to the other colleagues.
Well, you asked us to focus on one question, but since Adolf touched several, let me do the same and just add. On the macro-micro point, I think that we've heard a lot over the past years, especially with Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals, the idea of leaving no one behind. Well, the first thing we must leave behind is the top-down approach. So and I think that it's ingrained in the GPI approach that it would not just stay at the top. On the contrary, and with multilateral development banks, I think that, and there was some comment or reference to multilateral development banks being just the powerful and I honestly don't think so. I think that one of the elements of the multilateral system that we have given ourselves to date is that it's the countries that are members of these systems, are members of these organizations. And the organizations, I think we're a bit unfair when we speak of the UN or a multilateral development bank XYZ not doing well or not doing what we expect of them, because it's the countries, it's the governments that are deciding within those systems, within those organizations. And they can only be what the governments allow them to be, bottom line. And so I think the idea of the coalition of governments and multilateral organizations that we are working on is precisely that, to bring governments and decision makers into a system and into an approach that will then bring these changes about in the organizations, in the institutions that we will inevitably have to have. I mean, we will need institutions, different institutions, or institutions working from a different perspective and with a different approach. But it's in many ways, it's the governments that will decide. And what we want to do is precisely to bring in the views of civil society, bring in the views of citizens into these different processes. So I think that is something that again, but what we must leave behind is the top-down approach or way of looking at things. And in terms of the fact that it takes time to change a narrative, yes, it takes time, and it will take time. And in this case, just to even test what we are aiming to do. We have a 3-year, or 2.5-year now, time frame to identify and to try to put in place projects, pilot experiences that will actually put this into practice. Thank you.
Simon.
Thank you. I'm not sure which questions are left or have been answered. So let me just say a couple of things that I think cover a lot of the very important insights you were saying. If I can have some wine or a little water, maybe, first of all. Look, I mean, I think you mentioned India. The Indian scholar Amartya Sen has this lovely idea of what development cooperation is. He calls it development as freedom. So the question is, how do we bring about real freedom? And that's about capacitating individuals in different countries in ways that they require. You can be unfree in a quote-unquote rich country just as you can be unfree in a quote-unquote poor country. The challenge that we confront today is to bring those pieces together. And I think I would push back a little bit at the idea that we're starting at a global level and trying to sort of find ways of rolling this out. This idea has come very much from the local. It's come from hearings and consultations and discussions through civil society and through academia. And we get to the point now where we need a global discussion. And we get to that point just in time, because to the other question around, you know, what do the last 20 years tell us? Are we really moving in this direction? Well, you know, science tells us that we're going to hit 1.5 degrees this century. We haven't got time to spend another 30, 40 years figuring this out. And I think increasingly governments are going to realize this, and they're going to be more willing to cooperate. Then they're going to need guidance. And that's what we hope this coalition, but also the ideas, the principles of GPI will be able to provide them. And if I just finish on one final point, which is about, although my text has now gone over this, this point about facts. I go back to what you said, Adolf. The world has changed. You know, 40, 50 years ago, we lived in what you might think of as a two-hump world. You know, there was a north and a south. There was poverty and there was riches. And however you break that down, actually, inequality within countries, whether you break it down in GDP per capita, whether you break it down in where the middle class were, there was always two lumps, one side and another side. And it comes to your point too, Jörg. We don't live in that world anymore. If you run the numbers, you'll see everything accumulates in the middle. This is why we need a system that is adapted to that world where we are all in the same boat. We're all in it together. That's what global public investment is one part of the answer to. It doesn't claim to be every part of the answer. And there are reforms, as we had a discussion earlier today, that are needed in other sectors. There are reforms in the traditional aid sector, and there are reforms in the MDB system and the banks. This is relevant to all of those reform agendas, but it's not responsible for all of them. It's a new way of raising and developing the right narrative around financing new challenges that we confront together, that we realize we confront together, and what we believe there will be increasingly the political will to finance together. From that flows everything else, and we have to build and hope that we get the system we deserve. So it's about taking the steps we can take from where we are. It's about moving forward very much in listening mode as well as in telling mode, from governments, from civil society, from other stakeholders as well. And it's about making sure that we build that system with the public first and foremost in mind. That's as important as the global element, but it will shake out through a much enhanced international system. That's what we're hoping for. So, you know, it's been really good to hear a lot of these questions and thoughts, and we look forward to taking them forward.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for having participated in this panel. You realize that you have been speaking with friends of the GPI idea and not critics. But I think that when we confront the ambition of GPI with the reality of international cooperation at the moment, we see two things. We see a desperate need for change in the structures and the willingness to cooperate, and at the same time we see, despite these structural changes you have been describing in the distribution of productive capacity and wealth between North and South, what we also see, for example, is still this crippling debt crisis and the crisis of public finance in the South. And then, so if we zoom in, we see that there are adverse conditions really for promoting this change. But On the other hand, what we also see is in my personal experience, I call it like this. I often have the impression that we here in the North are really shaken by Trump's activities and how we are seeing the rules-based order crumble. And as Mark Carney put it yesterday at Davos, he actually said, now we are feeling what many countries in the global South have always felt, that the rules of the game were not made for them. So we are sort of awaking to reality. And this is a difference to what we had in the past. And it might lead, it's leading many actors now to say, okay, let's now put our national interest first. But we actually know that cooperation brings better solutions. So I think as old structures are crumbling, that's always an opportunity for change. And I think it's important to have these conceptual debates and your pilot phase for actually gathering experience and being prepared when there is more willingness, more appetite for engaging in constructive changes. So thank you all and have a nice evening. Thank you for being here.